Hey guys, Negative9 here, how's it going everybody? And in my last video, I had talked a little bit about Ascension and how before Heart of Thorns released, there were a lot of references to it in the living world, specifically in the mission Arcana Obscura, in which you learn about the actual process of Ascension. Now as far as I can remember, Ascension didn't really play any huge part in the main story of Heart of Thorns. It was more focused on the Pact, Mordramoth, and Glint's Egg. This made me wonder why they could have been pushing this theme of Ascension so hard before launch, if it wouldn't really have any part to play in the main story. And then I remembered Rytlock. Back in Living World Season 2, Rytlock attempted to reverse the Foefire's curse using his sword Sahothan and fragments of the magical crown inherited by King Adalbern. Ultimately, the ritual of cleansing failed, however his sword was suddenly sucked down into the mists. As the sword was Ascalon's only hope of reversing the Foefire, Rytlock jumped into the mists after it. From that point onward, we saw nothing of Rytlock for quite a while. That is, until ArenaNet released this promotional image for Point of No Return, the 8th and final episode of Living World Season 2, content that Rytlock ultimately wouldn't even appear in. This was the first time that we saw Rytlock as a Revenant, and as you can imagine, the community exploded with speculation. Naturally, the first assumption people made was that he had somehow ascended because of his blindfold, similar to the one Cormyr wore. Cormyr, of course, being the first and only mortal that we know of to ascend into godhood. Interestingly enough, this speculation was quickly dismissed, and the most popular theory was that Rytlock had somehow become a ritualist. The ritualist was a profession in Guild Wars 1 that channeled spirits from the mists, and coincidentally also wore a blindfold. It was a reasonable assumption to make back then, but we now know that Rytlock isn't quite a ritualist. Don't get me wrong, Revenants are very similar and obviously have some common themes, but I don't think Revenants replaced ritualists. I think Revenants are something completely new. And I do believe that while in the mists, Rytlock did indeed manage to ascend, but before I go on, let's explain what Ascension is in the first place. Ascension is described as a state of communion with the old gods. Among other benefits, those who succeed in attaining it are able to travel through the mists, and with the right help can unlock hidden reserves of power. As well as being the masters of their heroic profession, Ascendants are able to grasp to an extent elements of all other professions. In 272 AE, Glint compiled the Flameseeker prophecies that foretold a group of chosen would rise and gain ascension in the Crystal Desert. So just reading through that, I can see some obvious similarities to Rytlock. Rytlock has traveled through the mists on 2 occasions that we know of. One, of course, not being through his own control. However, when Rytlock does return to the first mission in Heart of Thorns, he appears through a mist portal, and I don't think it looks anything like an accident. He seemed to be returning with a purpose. This makes me think that Rytlock does now have the power to travel through the mists on his own accord. As far as we know, Rytlock was the first and is the only Revenant currently in Tyria. This is ignoring players as I'm not quite sure they're exactly canon yet. But if Rytlock was indeed the first Revenant, wouldn't that mean he's the master of his chosen profession? I would certainly think so. It's a little hard to tell if he's able to grasp elements of all the other professions, but I think you could probably make an argument that the Revenant does take some things from the other professions to an extent. I think those are 3 solid indicators that Rytlock ascended in the mists, but I have a little bit more, so let's keep going. In Guild Wars 1, the player underwent the Hero's Journey, in which you complete the 3 trials necessary to attain Ascension. Rytlock was referenced to have gone on his own journey in the Living World promotional image, and at the very beginning of the very first trailer for Heart of Thorns.
The journey of the hero is filled with trials. Trials of courage, trials of loss, trials of war.
The goal of the first trial of Ascension was to gain the attention of the gods themselves. The second was to cleanse the body of earthly imperfections, and the third was to reforge the vision crystal so the gaze of the gods could be focused upon you. While there are other methods of ascending, it is interesting that when Rytlock disappeared, he was performing a cleansing ritual. And I would imagine that Rytlock suddenly appearing in the mists with a holy human artifact such as Sahothan would probably be noticed by the gods. We don't know how Rytlock could have focused the gods' attention on himself, but maybe he sacrificed his own eyesight to do it. After the player ascends in Guild Wars 1, you go to meet Glint, who happens to be a major part of the Revenant profession. This part is obviously pure speculation, but I do think it's plausible that this is how Rytlock could have ascended. Another possibility is that Rytlock ascended by some other means, perhaps through direct contact with the gods themselves. And that to me is more interesting because the Char pride themselves as being godless creatures that openly defy the human gods specifically. Imagine a Char becoming ascended. For some people that may be a knock on this theory, but for me the irony of a Char meeting the human gods almost makes me think it's something ArenaNet would do. So I've given you guys some theories on how Rytlock could have ascended, but if he really did ascend, what does that mean for our current story heading into the future? Well, one of the other benefits of Ascension was the gift of True Sight. True Sight prevents beings that slip out of phase with the world from becoming invisible to those with the gift. The most notable beings that could become invisible were the Mursat. The Mursat, also known as the Unseen Ones, are a race of floating humanoid spellcasters who are considered gods by the White Mantle. In Guild Wars 2, we had previously had no contact with the White Mantle or the Mursat until now. In the second raid wing Salvation Pass, the final boss is Matthias Gabriel, the fanatic leader of the bandits in the Forsaken Thicket, and more importantly, an Inquisitor of the White Mantle. After you defeat Matthias, there is a cutscene that explains the history of the Mursat and the White Mantle. The main question that the player is left with after this cutscene is why the White Mantle have now become active. The Guild Wars 2 community seems to have come to the conclusion that Lazarus the Dyer, possibly the very last living Mursat, is on the verge of returning. This could have many implications for our story going forward, but it also leaves Rytlock in an interesting place if we are going to go with this theory that he has ascended. If Rytlock has the gift of True Sight, he would be capable of seeing Lazarus the Dyer, while the rest of us wouldn't unless he purposefully showed himself to us. This could be why in Heart of Thorns we never got an explanation from Rytlock on what happened during his time in the Mists. ArenaNet could be saving this story for Season 3 of The Living World, and personally I wouldn't be too surprised if the White Mantle and Rytlock were both heavily involved. At the end of the day, this is just a theory, but it's one that seems pretty reasonable, and I was actually surprised that I'd never seen it anywhere else, so I thought I'd go ahead and share it. I hope I explained this theory well enough, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Feel free to leave your comments below and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. I'll see you guys next time.